name is Julian. Whether you're joining us on YouTube above or on Instagram below, I'm so glad that you're here. If you're new to this channel, about 2.5 years ago, I left my job in academia and began live streaming free and open access philosophy and theory lectures. My goal was to make high abstract philosophy concepts more accessible, but in a way that wouldn't completely dumb them down and turn them into content. And so my hope is that these lectures, which remain free and remain 8 a.m. live broadcasts every Monday morning, are an entry point for you into philosophy and theory. But for those of you who are more advanced readers and learners, this will hopefully provide you with some fruitful handholds as well. As per usual, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our patrons who continue to keep this project financially viable. If you'd like to download all of my lectures as an audio podcast, plus access my ebook Introduction to Zizek, please consider becoming a patron at www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. In fact, a friendly reminder that my current ebook, The Introduction to Zizek, titled And Yet It Moves, is available for another 2 weeks. If you'd like to read it, make sure that you get it before July 31st, when it will be replaced by the next installment. In fact, all of these lecture series are 3-month series, and patrons can get an accompanying ebook at the end of each series. So for example, right now we're in the midst of a series which I've titled The Divine Madness, which engages with Zizek's conceptualization of Christianity from a philosophical perspective. And at the end of the month, we're going to be finishing that series. However, if you're just dropping in for the first time now, fret not. Each of these lectures can be enjoyed standalone, so you really don't need to have watched any of the previous ones. But you can find all of them posted for free on my YouTube and on my Instagram. I'd also like to do a shout out to everybody who is joining us from across the world. Please do leave a comment letting me know where you are joining us from. I already see Brazil. Good morning, Brazil. Makes me very, very happy to know that we are joined by people who enjoy philosophy and theory as much as I do. That is really ultimately the goal of this project, is to create a community of people who relish in philosophy and theory and who enjoy engaging in it. I see Cologne, I see China, I see Bangladesh, hello, India, Hawaii, California, Greece, Berlin, Kurdistan. It is a veritable world map. That is incredible. Thank you guys so much. Really means a lot to me. Okay, so today I would like to do another deep dive into Zizek's take on Christianity. And the topic today is going to be relating to his argument about God in pain. This is also the title of one of his co-written books on religion, titled God in Pain, if you're curious. This is a really quite lovely volume that is co-written with Gunjevich. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. So today we're going to be talking about God in pain. We're also going to be talking about what Zizek calls the 3 modalities of the Lacanian real. And I'm going to try to do it in a way that is hopefully accessible with some references to movies and stuff like this. After all, I don't want this to be entirely obscurantist. Okay, let us begin. I'm going to be here for about 45 minutes or so, and then afterwards I'm going to host a Q&A for our Discord members. If you'd like to access Discord, you can get that through any of the subscription services that I offer. Okay, let us begin. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. It's early here. So Zizek begins his argument about God in pain by saying that there are essentially 3 approaches to the problem of evil. That most religious people, when they're confronted with the existence of evil in the world, for example, wars or a child who dies prematurely, etc., that there tend to be 3 common explanations for the existence of God and the persistence of evil. 1, that God has a divine plan, that everything that happens for a reason, even though that reason may be unknown to us. Secondly, that God does not have a plan, that God is a remote figure who doesn't engage with the particular realities of human existence, that God's viewpoint is so detached from the human world that it is a little bit like us looking at an ant heap. We don't see the individual tragedies of the ants, we simply see the ant colony. And then the final consideration, which is the one that Zizek is interested in, is the idea that God is aware of evil and that God suffers. That God is impotent to change the reality or the fate of those who suffer from evil. Now, of course, we could do an entire conceptualization on the problem of evil, which I'm not going to do here, although if you're interested, Terry Eagleton has a really nice accessible volume on evil, where he does exactly that. But what Zizek is basically pointing out here is that the three ethical considerations apropos God attribute to God a kind of unknowable divine meaning, a system of, let's say, idealism that posits that God knows why things happen, even if that meaning remains mysterious to us, juxtaposed with an unknowing God who doesn't know what is happening to us, and then finally a God who knows precisely what is happening and yet has nothing that he can that there's nothing that he can do about it. Here Zizek actually often refers to a joke, which in characteristically Zizek fashion is a slightly provocative joke. I think the most well-known example of it you can find on YouTube is the Oxford Union speech where he covers this joke. And essentially he's referring to the second position. The second position being that God was not there, that God does not know. And in this case, it's the joke, I'm terrible at telling jokes, but the joke basically works like this, which is that after Auschwitz, of course, the question was, how could Auschwitz have occurred? How could evil on such a scale have taken place? How does this corroborate with the existence of God? And the joke sketches a picture of heaven. And in heaven, God walks over and finds a group of Jewish victims of the Holocaust talking animatedly amongst themselves and cracking jokes. And God is curious. He wants to know what they're laughing about. And so God walks over to them, and one of the Jewish men looks over his shoulder to God, and he says, "Oh no, you couldn't possibly understand. You weren't there." That is essentially Zizek's slightly provocative joke about this ethical imposition of a God who doesn't know, who cannot know because he wasn't there. In other words, that when evil occurs, we have in a sense the exact opposite of the Christological motif of where there is love, you will find me. Where there is evil, there is no God. Now, these three modalities, if you will, through which one can see the problem of evil, one, God who knows the higher cause that is not revealed to us. Two, God who was not there, the absent or missing God. And finally, the suffering God are Zizek's main theological preoccupations with the role of God. And I want to hone in a little bit more on God in pain, the idea of a suffering God. This is actually something that you can find in a from a completely different source. If you read, as I was doing recently, this is quite a lovely text, Borges's This Craft of Verse, which is a collection of lectures. This is just the sleeve. This is just the sleeve. I don't like reading books with sleeves on them. This is a collection of lectures that he gave in 67, 68 at Harvard University. And there's a specific point here in the Borges lectures where he makes an argument, of course, which he also makes in his writing, but here in the lecture, where he essentially says about God, let me find the exact quote, quote, "The idea that God wanted to know all about human suffering, and that it was not enough for him to know it intellectually, as a God might. He wanted to suffer as a man, and with the limitations of a man." So here we have one theory about the suffering of God, that, to go back to the original theme and title of this lecture series, we have here the divine madness of God, which is that God is all-knowing, but not all-experiencing, if you will. And that which remains barred from God is precisely the kernel of human subjectivity, which, from a properly existentialist position, is suffering. And that God, therefore, wanted to taste of man's experience, and in order to do so, he had to suffer. And in order to do so, he had to become man, Christ on the cross. Now, there are certain limitations to this point of view. Certainly, it does not correspond to Zizek's own position, but I believe that this is one of the inspirations that Zizek has for the idea of a suffering God. In fact, the argument is essentially, and here we can contrast Borges to Zizek. For Borges, God suffers because God is curious. God needs to know. Whereas for Zizek, God suffers because suffering is the only way through which God can see himself. Zizek describes it as, you should imagine God plucking out his own eyeball and then looking at himself through it. And this plucked eyeball is Christ. In In fact, Zizek puts it in a very literal formula. In God in Pain, Zizek writes, Christ is the anamorphosis of God. And the word anamorphosis is quite specific here. It's a reference to the Lacanian theory of anamorphosis. Or to put it in a more Kafkaesque way, sometimes the only way to see something right is to see something wrong. Lacan's essential argument, to simplify it enormously, is that anamorphosis is the truth of all subjectivity, which is that we don't see things for what they are. Everything is constituted by the subject. This isn't a simple relativism. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's not that anything could mean anything. It's that nothing means anything unless it is actively subjugated through subjective cognition. And I'll return to that in a little bit to make it a little bit more clear, because I realize that's still highly abstract. But there's a lot to cover here, and I don't want to get sort of caught in the woods. So Zizek then says that if we have this idea of a suffering God, we have to juxtapose it with two ways of conceptualizing God. One, the positing of God as an unknowable other, as someone who exists as a sublime entity that resists subjective cognition, or as God as a kind of presence, a God who is here, a God who exists within human suffering itself. In other words, we have either the Borgesian God who comes down to earth to suffer amongst us, almost as if it were kind of disaster tourism, as it were, versus the idea that God's presence is precisely in his absence, in the material world of human existence. And here we can basically see the sort of traditional idealist attitude, which is secretly still very much the pagan attitude, by which Christ has to appear as a monstrously inadequate figure. Remember, last week I talked about how Hegel characterized Christ as someone who is hardly representative of God, someone who comes as an enormous shock, someone who represents itself in the claim that Christ is God is so entirely revolutionary, because the question is, how can God be made manifest in such a low human form? This pre-New Testament argument about Christ being inadequate to be the quote-unquote representative of God, let alone the exact embodiment of God, is still very much the pagan attitude. There's a beautiful rendition of this in one of my favorite movies, which is the Monty Python and the Holy Grail film, in which at a certain point, the king, of course, the central comedy of the movie is that the king has to go throughout the land, but no one really knows that he is king. That King Arthur goes throughout the land, and at a certain point, two peasants, who are literally just shoveling shit, look up at the king, and one of them says, "It's the king." And the other peasant says, "How do you know it's the king?" And he says, "Well, he's not covered in shit." Here we have sort of the pagan, idealist, pre-Christ on the cross hierarchy, which is that what makes God God is that he's not covered in shit. And that Christ, specifically Christ on the cross, is, as it were, covered in shit. Accuse the vulgarity of the example here, but there is a quite literal being covered in shit element here, even within the orthodoxy, which is the idea of kenosis. After all, the Greek word kenosis is to empty oneself out. And Zizek's argument is that what takes place on the cross, this is of course a Hegelian argument, is a double kenosis. That God empties himself out through Christ, and one doesn't have to take the scatological reference here. One can also refer to Zizek's idea of God plucking out his own eyeball. That God empties himself out through Christ and reveals himself to himself, but vice versa, that Christ is precisely the Redeemer in emptying himself out for man so that man can recognize himself. If you will, there's a chiastic sequence here. Remember, the rhetorical figure of chiasm is A, B, X, B, A. Now, what happens here is that we have God, man, Christ is the X, and then we have man, God. That God sees himself through man, and man sees himself through God. It's a rhetorical form of chiasm which accurately renders the dialectical movement that takes place in this double kenosis, this double emptying out. Hopefully this will also help you understand why Zizek in multiple books alludes to the idea of an incontinent void, or in fact, a kind of Hegel with diarrhea, if you will. Again, excuse the vulgar metaphor, but Zizek is being quite literal here, that this emptying out, the incontinence of the void, as he terms it, is precisely the dialectical movement of Aufhebung. And hence the shock, the revolutionary aspect of the Christian event, Christ on the cross, being precisely the encounter in a proper chiasmic sequence of the highest and the lowest, the sacred and the profane. Hence also why some of the more traditional readings of kenosis as being the fact that the figure of Jesus emptied himself of worldly desire so as to ascend into the heavens, thereby precisely eliminates this excremental aspect within the movement of kenosis as such. Now, Zizek isn't simply arguing that there are two moments of kenosis that occur, that there's the kenosis of God and the kenosis of man. Instead, strictly speaking, he's arguing that all kenosis is double kenosis, that the movement implicit in kenosis is therefore not the closing of a gap between fallen man and God in the sky, but precisely the elimination or the positing of a constitutive gap that becomes necessary for God to realize himself inasmuch as man realizes himself. To put that in a little bit less abstract way, although still highly theoretical, this is also how you might understand Lacan's well-known maxim that God is the unconscious. This is not, as some people might like to think, a simple embrace of the existential position that God is dead, but specifically that God is this materialized void, this incontinence of the void that leaks out into the excremental substance, which is the properly subjective position. Now, I'm going to slow down a little bit here because there's a couple elements that I'd like to introduce. One of the interesting things, to my mind, about contemporary secular existence, be it atheist or not, is that there tends to be a popular sentiment that presents the relationship to the unknown as being that of an almost absurdist experience of the finite nature of one's own being. Think about TikTok videos, earnest, pseudo-philosophical TikTok videos that posit that you look into the sky and faced with the expanse of the universe, you suddenly feel very, very small and like life has no meaning. And then you suddenly realize that this is precisely what makes life meaningful, that life has no meaning. It's an elegant solution, which you might refer to as a kind of existentialism light, and yet this positing of a kind of curious surprise, an existential awareness of the mystery of existence, is precisely an idealist position that essentially posits an unknowable other or void back onto that which lies outside of human cognition. Of course, in a beautifully almost Hegelian way, here we have the unity of opposites. Here we have that which appears to be the negation of theistic faith re-emerging in its disavowed form, namely the secular embrace of there is so much I don't know, the universe is infinite, and my life is finite in relationship to it. It's also why Hegel argues that Protestantism, being quote-unquote the necessary sort of dialectical unfolding of Catholicism, then leads to the Enlightenment. That the Enlightenment is not the antithesis to religion, but in fact simply its disavowed form, where you might also therefore say that Protestantism is the vanishing mediator for this atheist secular stance, this rediscovery of the transcendental void that is posited outside of human cognition, that thereby makes to seem the finite flame of human existence burn, thereby thus the brighter. Essentially, to go back to the idea of the vanishing mediator, remember the definition of the vanishing mediator, which Jameson writes about in relationship to Max Weber, is that the vanishing mediator is that which universalizes itself in its supposed antithesis, in its supposed negation. The Weberian version of this is to say, of course, that the Protestant ethic becomes universalized in the spirit of capitalism, and that atheist secular capitalism, which therefore appears to be the antithesis to Protestantism, is in fact its universal realization in disguise. And you could therefore argue that the same thing occurs within contemporary sort of pseudo-mystical wonder, very sincere, that occurs apropos this unknowable gazing into the stars and realizing how finite and small you are. That we here have religion returning in a universalized form in disguise, as it were. Now, Zizek actually picks up on this. Oh, I'm back. Sorry, I briefly lost the connection. Zizek actually picks up on something very similar to this. Zizek says that a lot of these contemporary engagements with sort of the mystery and wonder of the unknown, often from a scientific perspective, right? All the things that we do not yet know, the depths of the ocean, the expanse of the universe, etc., that these remain entirely sincere, that they're almost too serious in a way. And Zizek says that this actually misses the properly comedic element of the crucifixion. Now, what is the properly comedic element of the crucifixion? We've already kind of hinted towards it, which is that when Hegel characterizes Christ as die Unangemessenheit überhaupt, namely that which is wholly, no pun intended, inadequate in terms of a mere representation of God. How can the divine be represented in such a lowly human form? In other words, if God is that which is not covered in shit, how can Christ then be God? This is the gentile response, of course, to Christ, that then mocks him as the savior who cannot even save himself, etc. That if this is the precondition upon which God is based, and Christ therefore is based, and the Trinity and the human faith is therefore based, then this can only appear to us as comedic, as a meeting of the highest and the lowest. As I said before, the double kenosis, the emptying itself out, itself already implies a comedic element. And of course, for anyone who's read Brecht, or if you've read Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or even Borges, you will have found the recurring theme that that one person's tragedy is another person's comedy. In fact, that comedy and tragedy are, strictly speaking, not two separate entities. That comedy exists within tragedy. Now, I don't simply mean comedy as in like the Italian commedia dell'arte, in which we have different characters pursuing things that are necessarily contradictory to each other. Instead, what I mean here is that imagine someone from a distance falls down a flight of stairs. Of course, if we were close to it, it would be horrific. But if we're far enough away from it, it becomes comedic. This is the essence of slapstick. Think about all those YouTube fail videos where people enjoy laughing hysterically in their homes at other people suffering great misfortune. And so comedy and tragedy are not simply antithetical to each other. It's not that one makes you sad and that the other makes you happy. It's that the comedic element lies precisely in the disproportionate relationship of suffering to lived existence as such. This isn't simply to say that suffering is the truth of all existence in a sort of pseudo-existentialist way, but to say that suffering reveals a kind of truth. Thereby, comedy reveals a kind of truth. Now, if one views the crucifixion as therefore a comedic event, and I understand how provocative that argument appears, but bear with me. If one views the crucifixion as a comedic event, namely a meeting of the highest and the lowest, God in human form, God in fallen form, God in pain, then you start realizing what Zizek's argument about God in pain. That God in pain is a God who suffers, who is thereby a comedic God, and that the comedy of God's suffering is precisely human redemption. That the precondition for the human awakening to itself, the properly subjective realization of Earth as the central locality of the faith, rather than the positing of a divine unknowable substance, is therefore, if you will, the divine comedy. The divine comedy being God in pain, or God's suffering, which is thereby transposed through the figure of Christ into the realization of man. The central condition of man being the fact that man suffers. I hope that makes sense. Hopefully. I keep saying that, but I can't know. But I hope that this will help you. Now, let's take those ideas and let's relate them back to Zizek's argument about Lacan and his Lacanian interpretation of Hegel. So, as I've mentioned in previous lectures, Zizek's central argument is that there are two ways of viewing reality. There is an idealist way of viewing reality and a materialist way of conceptualizing reality. The idealist conception of reality posits that there is an unknowable horizon of human cognition that cannot be known. I mean, sorry for the tautology, unknowable, you understand what I mean, that there is a point of reference that cannot be seen, that there is some deeper hidden meaning or truth that cannot be accessed by the subject. Whether this is the Kantian position of the things in themselves, or the Platonic, traditional, quote-unquote, naive idealism that posits truth outside the cave, we have a transposition of truth, the pure form, outside the realm of human cognition. In other words, there's a gap between the subject and truth. Then we have a transposition of this gap back into subjectivity itself. this would be a materialist position. In other words, a materialist position isn't simply that which fills in idealism by weighing it down through weighty material considerations about the real world versus the mysticism of the ideal. Instead, materialism, in its most Lacanian definition, is thereby precisely a form of anamorphosis. That materialism is none other than the gap that is constitutive to reality itself. In other words, not the gap between reality and the subject's inaccessible, the fact that the subject is not able to access it, but that this inaccessibility, this gap, is reality itself. Not the barrier to the thing, but the thing itself. Now, Zizek's argument, therefore, relates back to the Lacanian theory of the real. And Zizek says, one has to conceptualize the Lacanian theory of the real, therefore, as having three modalities. So what is the Lacanian theory of the real? Zizek says, imagine a snail or some other shellfish. Within the shell, we have this slimy substance, the creature, yet a creature that seems to be devoid of any kind of particular features as such. In fact, what appears to determine or over-determine this snail creature is its shell. And yet, fundamentally, the shell never appears to fully correspond to that which lies within. It always seems kind of mysterious how this little blob of a creature could be deserving of such a house, of such a shell. And Zizek says on a very simple level, this is how we can conceptualize the real. That the real is like this amorphous blob that exists inside the shell. And we identify the shell as being the snail when it is in fact the slimy creature that lies within the shell. However, this would be too simplistic of a reading because Zizek never posits that the Lacanian real is simply a kind of a priori unknowable slimy substance upon which we build the material reality of the shell. Instead, Zizek says that the one cannot exist without the other. In the same way that the shell doesn't exist without the slimy substance within, the slimy substance within doesn't exist without the shell. Hence why Zizek argues that there are three modalities, at least, of the real. One, we have the real as the kind of horrific return of the repressed, that which has to be fundamentally and structurally disavowed in order for reality to be constituted and embraced by the subject. He uses here examples from cinema, for example, like the Alien in Ridley Scott's movie being a form of the real or the thing. Then we have the real. So, and Zizek characterizes this, let me be clear. This is what Zizek calls the real real. And so the first modality of the real is the real real, which is a kind of return of the repressed, of this amorphous snail-like substance that has to be disavowed in order to engage with the material existence of the shell. But it comes back to haunt us, as it were. And we see this in most horror movies. It's that thing which goes bump in the night as soon as we close our eyes. That which has to be primordially repressed in order to participate in the social order. And that is like the horror element that Zizek attributes to the real as real. Zizek then juxtaposes this with the symbolic real. What is the symbolic real? He says, imagine a mathematical formula or a mathematical formula in quantum physics. Strictly speaking, this formula tells the truth of the functioning of the universe, or at least it allows us to say something about it, to ascertain it or divine it. However, it is by itself meaningless. You could look at this formula and nothing about the universe is revealed to you. It's simply a symbolic version of the quote-unquote unknown, of that which has to be materialized through a kind of formula of its own impossibility, namely the mathematical formula. Here we have the symbolic real, the real that is presented to us not as the monstrous thing that leaps out of the shadows, but precisely that which exists in the lights, the mathematical formula that nevertheless remains obscure, or at least tries to put into symbolic form that which is obscure. Here we can actually relate to something that I read recently about Goya, the artist, a really wonderful observation by John Berger. John Berger argued that one of the magnificent things about Goya is that instead of positing that things exist in the shadows, in the dark, that in the dark we find monsters and human suffering, etc., he makes the exact opposite argument, that these things always exist in the light. And John Berger actually argues here that Goya's own experience of warfare probably informed this aesthetic principle. That in war, darkness means safety, light means danger. That as soon as you are in the light, you are exposed. That as soon as you are in the light, that you are precisely at risk of being subjectively made destitute. And that is essentially what Zizek's position about the symbolic real is. That in the real real, we have the real of darkness, the real of the shadow, that which has to be repressed. Whereas in the symbolic real, we have the real that we use to cope in its given or in a given form in the light. All the things that we use as handholds that don't suppress the real by putting it under the table or under the bed, but precisely elevate it into a central position. Here we have the symbolic real, which could therefore be a mathematical formula in as much as it could be the pinky finger of a relic saint, a saint in relic form. Now, the third modality of the real for Zizek isn't the real real or the symbolic real, it's the imaginary real. If you're familiar with Lacan, here we have the famous Lacanian triad, the real, symbolic, and the imaginary. Now, the imaginary real for Zizek is again this positing of a kind of transcendental, unknowable je ne sais quoi, something that makes you feel momentarily like you are in touch with some divine other presence. And this doesn't even have to be religious. This can be a kind of embrace of the gap that is integral to human cognition as such. Think about the film based upon the book, A Single Man, Tom Ford's movie. There's a great scene at the end of the movie where the main character, played by Colin Firth, who is about to commit suicide, has a moment of perfect clarity, a moment in which he steps outside his door, and for the first time in a long time, he can smell the air, he can hear everything around him, he sees everything clearly. And it's a kind of moment of not happiness, but ultimate clarity. This is what Zizek would call the imaginary real, that moment in which you seem to have temporarily stepped out of the confusion of participation in the symbolic order to tap into some kind of unknowable truth, some kind of inner happiness that emerges within this stepping away as such. Of course, it's no accident that this occurs at the exact moment that the character George is about to take his own life. That we have here the kind of truth that is revealed to him in the peace of having let go of his own subjectivity, of his own death drive, as it were, which is therefore replaced with a literal drive towards death. Now, I want to very briefly note that this is in no way me endorsing self-harm or a suicidal ideation. Please do not take it in that way, and trigger warning for everybody who feels sensitive about these topics. And so here we have three modalities of the real for Zizek. One, we have the real real, the kind of figure of the monstrous thing, John Carpenter's thing that comes to haunt us, to bite us like some kind of specter. Then we have the symbolic real, which is the real in the light, as it were. It's the mathematical formula of the unknown. It's the relic. It's that which tries to put in some kind of material substance, a placeholder for all that which cannot be known or accepted, or in other words, has to be accepted as unknowable in order to participate in social reality. And then we have finally the imaginary real, the stripping away or the seeming stripping away of all those features and the supposed direct engagement with some kind of transcendental meaning or purpose that reveals itself to us. Now, a lot of the words that I'm using here aren't strictly speaking true to Lacan's own position, but the reason I'm bringing them into focus in that way is because it helps us finally determine what Zizek's position is on God and pain, which is where I would like to conclude. So if you recall, Zizek says that the central philosophical project is the relationship between idealism and materialism. That idealism posits an unknowable ontological void onto a transcendental horizon that is unknowable to us, that cannot be reached. And that materialism precisely transposes this gap back into the world, back into subjectivity itself. In other words, it's not the gap between subjectivity and truth. It is that truth is precisely this gap, and that subjectivity is the material form that this gap takes on. To bring it back to the theme of kenosis, we could therefore say that what happens within materialism is that idealism empties itself out in material form. Hence again why it's not correct to see materialism as the mere antithesis to idealism, but that rather that which emerges necessarily from within idealism as such. Zizek's theological argument is therefore, building upon Hegel, that this is what happens in the crucifixion. That the unfolding of the previously existing transcendental hierarchy, namely God in the sky and man below on earth, finds itself in its opposite, oh, we lost the connection again, in its opposite Are you still here? In its opposite but truest form. In other words, through the act of kenosis, God emptying himself out to see himself through human suffering, and humans being emptied out of God, right? Ridding themselves, purging themselves with the idea of a transcendental other in the sky in order to properly see themselves. That is Zizek's argument, therefore, which is that what we see in the crucifixion is essentially a materialist event. That the crucifixion might well be the first materialist event within the history of what then would later become dialectical materialism or the philosophy of Marxism. Hence, why it's important not to simply say, well, Jesus was a communist because Jesus hung out with beggars and prostitutes, etc., but that on a very logical level, what happens in the crucifixion is precisely a materialist gesture. Oh, I think we're back. Sorry, I keep losing the connection on Instagram. Are we back? Yes, I'm so glad. Thank you, YouTube, for bearing with me. Are we here? Oh, no. I'm sorry about the troubleshooting. This is why I record everything on 2 devices, and I record the audio. I think we're here. Perfect. Okay. Yes, okay. I just want to make sure that we're not losing the connection again. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with me. And so Zizek's argument about God in pain is that God in pain is therefore not simply a God who feels like humans do, but precisely a God who has to become alien to himself so as that humans might lose God so as to come home to themselves. Hence why Zizek's argument, as I've stated before, is that there's a kernel of atheism within Christianity, that the truth of the crucifixion is therefore a kind of atheism that redeems Christianity, that Christ becomes the vanishing mediator by which we have God universalized through his perceived opposite, namely, oh, we've lost this out, namely, atheism. Oh, I think we may have lost the sound on Instagram. I am so sorry, everybody. If you want to, yeah, that's really unfortunate. I think the sound is cut off on Instagram. 1 second. I'm going to try to write down a message for everybody on Instagram. 1 second. I'm going to write, sound is not working. Will upload on YouTube. All right. Let's see if that works. I hope this isn't going to be inverted. Oh, it's inverted. Of course it's inverted. Okay, let me type that in here real quick. Apologies about the, let's see. Sound not working. Will upload on YouTube. I'm so sorry about this. It's really unfortunate. Okay, so then I'm going to try to wrap up here in the final moments. I will say goodbye to everybody on Instagram for a moment. There we go. Hello, YouTube. Now it is just us. I'm sorry about all the troubleshooting that we've had. I really appreciate you guys. You know that everything here is on a shoestring budget. I record everything on my phone, so it's simply like whatever we can make do with. And so let me wrap up a little bit prematurely here by means of a short summary. Zizek's argument about God and pain is therefore that one must imagine a suffering God, a God who suffers so as to become external to himself, thereby revealing his truth not to himself, but through man, and that man's truth is thereby precisely suffering, redeemed in coming home to God. Now, that seems incredibly abstract, but essentially what Zizek is arguing is that there's a dialectical or even chiasmic movement, which he refers to as a double kenosis, an emptying out of God into man and of man into God. And that therefore precisely atheism emerges as the truth of God. And ironically, that contemporary secular approaches to atheism actually refuse this radical revolution in the faith by means of staging a kind of pseudo-religious idealism that is mystified by all of the unknown in the world. Hence, Zizek's Chestertonian argument is that the proper way to be an atheist today is to be a Christian, and that to be an atheist is actually to uphold a kind of Christian ethic that is outdated and no longer relevant since the crucifixion, as it were. And so Zizek's provocative argument relating to God and pain is that the only way to be a Christian today is to be an atheist, but also that the only way to be a real atheist is to be a Christian. And I hope that at the end of this lecture you can see why that is not just an absurd contradictory argument, but actually a step-by-step logical proposition that Zizek is trying to make using Lacanian psychoanalysis and Hegelian philosophy. Thank you guys so much. I'm sorry that it's a little bit shorter today due to technical difficulties. If you'd like to download all of my lectures and help me keep making these videos, please consider becoming a patron. I'd also like to give you a friendly reminder that my current ebook titled 5 Lessons on Zizek and Yet It Moves is available until the end of the month. And so if you'd like to download it before July 31st, please consider becoming a patron. Plus, if you sign up before the end of the month, you'll basically be able to access both this ebook and the next ebook for the price of one. Thank you to our patrons who continue to support this project, and thank you to everybody who has joined me live today. I really do appreciate it. I will see you next week.